All right, so welcome back to Innovation to Impact. I'm Stepan Baran, part scientist, part strategist, full-time translator between what biology knows and what tech can do for us. So last time, Brian opened up a can of worms, talking about attrition, and so that uncomfortable truth that 90% or plus 90% of what we do in drug development really doesn't make it. And so he called it an existential threat. And honestly, nothing says great business model like a 90% failure rate, right? So if you can imagine airlines operating this way, we probably would not be flying too often. But we didn't want to really leave you with that depressed note. So today we're going to be talking about how we're going to be addressing it. So Brian Barrage, who is a comparative and toxicologist pathologist, who spent his whole career bending the slope of diffusion of the innovation curve, doubles down on sustainability and a culture of learning and how it addresses attrition. Nick Kelly, who has been advancing the right ideas from pharma to venture capital, always with AI for life sciences lens, will address the aligning incentives and the future looking and how our approach and the way we think about health. And I'll talk about, how we are landing our plane. And that's literally the title of my last piece, my last article, and really arguing that attrition is not failure, it's data from which we should learn, but we really need to de-silo the proprietary data and investor disclaimers and include that and share the data between ourselves. So we will talk about the mentality and culture change that will lead to reducing attrition rate and helping patients. So we're going to hear three perspectives, one conversation. Not sure how much consensus you're going to get here. But with that, let's kick it off. Brian, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Stepan. I like the idea of putting a more positive spin. When I write these pieces, I often feel like that I'm being overly negative because I've got this sense of trying to embrace the problem and rather than try to run from them. And that's the only way I think that we can really solve them. But the reality of it is we need to focus on innovative solutions. I mean, that's what this is all about. So trying to find the balance between embracing the problems and finding new solutions is kind of where I like to live. In this particular piece, I did focus on the attrition problem because that's one that throughout my career in pharma has been most disappointing to me, I guess I should say. A lot of us get into pharma with this sort of energy of, we're going to do good things for patients. And then when you get in the midst of it, you recognize that actually most of the stuff that we do doesn't actually go on to benefit patients. And that's a little bit of a struggle. And so I grew up during a period of time that I think still exists, where we focused on shots on goal. So if we shoved enough into the pipeline, that occasionally something would come out the other end and it would be successful. And successful was it did something really good for patients. It didn't harm them. And the drug developer made money that they could reinvest into developing the next class of drugs. The other one was fast fail, which is how quickly can I get to a decision that this just isn't going to go anywhere. I didn't find either one of those things particularly energizing. And so I felt like that we weren't putting enough focus on the fundamental problem, which was, why are these things failing? Why is it in all the data that we generate and evidence that we generate in the preclinical space not playing out in our patients? And so I've felt like that we ought to be better students of the patients that ultimately we're trying to help and put more focus on the primary problem rather than try to manage with the latest technology ways of working around the fundamental problem. So that's what I was trying to convey in my contribution, and I think relates to the theme that we've tried to take on, which is how to do a better job of adopting and applying and being successful with novel technologies.
Yeah, no. So just to follow up on that, Brian, right? So the whole concept, right, of kind of flying the plane, right? So I feel like we keep adding all these different innovations on top of, additional engines as we're flying, like literally, and trying to fix it in flight. And I think once in a while, we need to really land, right, and open up the black box of attrition and identify and learn from it, and then kind of fix the plane on the ground and address those topics, right? Learn from what happens in the clinical trials when they fail, instead of just shutting it aside, right, and having somebody else either buying that compound or just putting on the shelf and never looking at it. Right? We never kind of do an assessment of really what happened. We just move to the next project, right? And then so that speed to a certain extent doesn't allow us to kind of, again, like I said, open up the black box of the attrition and then examine it and learn from it, right? So if we're going to continue to do that, we're going to keep crashing our plane just like we have been over decades because that, the failure rate that we talk about, that really has not changed over several decades. Even as we look back, even more recently, which we thought with some of these novel technologies that will change significantly.
Yeah. Now, I really like your analogy of adding accessories. At some point in time, you've added so many accessories, that plane doesn't stay in flight anymore. That's the sustainability issue.
So, listening to you guys, I want to put a different spin on it. And so, what you're talking about is, how can we, better capture the data as we go along, iteration, year after year, and how can we better learn from this, embrace the mistakes, and do better in the future. You're thinking of it, I think, primarily through the process of pharma discovery, drug discovery, and development, but ultimately this is to help, enable patients and get something to the patient. So can we also at the same time start learning immediately from the patient? And I do think, in the coming wave of high AI and machine learning are going to impact health as a whole, consumer health, preventative medicine, giving people tools for, to help, be healthier and happier, kind of fine tune their own behaviors is going to be a large part of this. And the pharma way, like from the beginning of thinking about this was often, let's make a digital therapeutic, create a perfect tool or solution, call it a therapy, and go invest in a clinical trial. But, I think you can take the same sort of, whether you call it, not failing fast, but let's call it learning fast. Like, how do we actually learn, what is the unmet need of those patients? What do they want? How can we best help them? So, maybe avoid the regulatory space and just start trying to answer these questions with some kind of, iteration one mental health tools. We can get them, start kind of a data flywheel going, engage with the end user, in this case, the patients. And that you should help us learn, a variety of things. One of the things we'll talk about in the future is closing that. I mean, not only can we process all of the data we could get from engaging with, patients or co-workers, whoever, we're in the age of digital sensors as well. And so we have, especially around kind of human quality of life, phenotype, we have all these different digital endpoints and metrics we can be collecting kind of as we go and iterating. And then maybe you do understand, okay, here's who benefits the most, who needs it, and what that looks like. And you can try to wrap that around kind of more of a therapeutic, regulated, clinical trial environment. But, again, maybe get out the gate with something lighter weight. And we can talk later, the point of that tool doesn't have to be for improving a patient's medical condition either. It can be, to augment or, add the kind of adjunct mentality to kind of support some of the existing therapies as well. But I do think there's still opportunity in many facets to kind of better learn. And so I'll pause there and hand it back to you guys.
Well, no, I really like the idea of a flywheel. And some part of that is actually having the intent to learn on the front end so that you facilitate that flywheel. One of the things that I think comes from a fast fail mentality is that I'm going to collect just enough information to make the decision and not think about all the ways that I could learn from the process of making that decision. So that changes that flywheel into a very linear process that you just keep doing. Yeah. And so we don't actually learn from it and ultimately apply those learnings. And so I think that fundamentally, and this kind of gets to what both of you have written, that you have to build in the intent to learn from the experience so that ultimately the next time you do it, you're smarter than this time. And I don't think we do that well enough, which is why I think we ignore the attrition problem, because we're just afraid that we can't solve it. And so I've got to figure out ways of managing around it. And I just don't believe that to be true. I think we're smarter than that.
So I mean, that kind of, just talking about the airline industry, right? So, so they have a global kind of, for us, what we should have, right? It's a global attrition registry, right? So when airlines kind of track near misses, right, and then they're forced to learn from them, right? For us, just you were talking about, Brian, right? We don't do that, right? So I think if we really structured learning, for example, across our submissions, right, and then looking what worked, what didn't work, but to go back and take that time to actually learn from it, I think that's what's really missing. Because again, everything, it's about speed, right? And I guess one of the ways, instead of fail fast, right, how about fail intelligently, right, as you guys were already talking about. That's one aspect. And I think just even, I mean, maybe a little bit to Nick, what you were talking about, helping patients, right? Or even before we become patients, right? So one of the not really recent technologies, right, for the VA, one of the challenges is the diabetic foot ulcers, right? Which if you do, I guess almost 25% or so veterans end up with that disease. And that can lead to amputations or even death, right? So at the VA, they identify a technology, which is a smart mat that you put it in a bathroom in front of a sink, and through thermal imaging, it measures the temperature of that patient. And then so with that, I actually pulled up some statistics here. So by utilizing that technology, they had 97% early detection of diabetic foot ulcers, 86% of patients' engagement after 1 year. That's ridiculously high. And 52% reduction in hospitalization and 40% reduction in ER visits, right? So that's a pretty basic technology, right? But it has enormous impact. But again, thinking of that aspect, right? How does that impact the patients and learning from it versus kind of just dumping another technology, another wearable on our patients?
Yeah, and what's the best way to go with that? There's a couple ways, but I really love that example, and I think part of the reason we haven't invested in preventative medicine, which in effect is learning from the patients at an earlier stage, is because who should actually make that investment, right? And luckily, AI has democratized certain types of tools, like mental health tools or weight loss tools, and patients are willing to start opening up their own wallets for this and investing in their own health, and that's kind of a cultural movement in itself. But the fact that due to these devices, like let's come back to this. What you mentioned is floor mat, right? I mean, in effect, in machine learning speak, you're closing the loop there. So like the same devices that are helping to coach you, guide you, modify your behavior, or give you alerts, or help give you a reminder for your pill, they can actually start to demonstrate the benefit you're receiving from intervening or having that tool. And what that does is it, quantifies the return on investment of that preventative health initiative or whatever it might be. We all know that incentives in health have been difficult. I like the cardio example. We all know that if you eat healthier, you'll be, have better cardiovascular outcomes later, but that might be 20 years later, it might be 50 years later. You might have changed insurances in the US 5 times. So who's actually the one getting the return on that investment? And so you have these issues. But I like this digital health space because, if the patients want it, if the patients can see that they're benefiting from it, you can actually start to quantify the health economics impact of these things as well. And that creates an incentive for healthcare payers, actually, even more so than the healthcare systems themselves. And so suddenly you've now, at least in a powerful way, aligned the incentive of two of the main stakeholders, right? The healthcare payers, at least, and the patients. And I love that example that you just used, right? That was like a very early days, like you have a bathroom mat, you're just, monitoring, part of your daily routine. And I'm going to have to come back to Brian, at that point, but it's, Brian had mentioned, he was part of something. One of you guys was talking about bathrooms of the future, as well, where you're just kind of in your daily routine measuring everything. That format is the perfect example. But we're now living in a world of the, of the bathroom of the future with Fitbits and Oura Rings and, just our own, digital devices. And, I'm going to talk probably in the future about, portable EEG. And so now, Shaipan, you were even talking about, closing down, these industrialized, centers because you were solving the problem before they got there. And I think that's the ultimate metric of success. And Brian was mentioning, some examples in this respect as well. And so, it takes understanding, getting some data, and learning, about the causes before it's too late. And I'll pause there and hand off to one of you guys. But I think it manifests itself even in a couple more ways as well.
Well, a key part of what you just said, though, and this is interesting to me because it starts to really explore the intersection between technology and our advancing understanding of biology and human health and all those kinds of things. So now we're able to start thinking of health and disease as more of a continuum. It's not healthy or not healthy and diseased. It's healthy, early onset, the ability to actually detect that early onset, actually modulate that early onset, and prevent the onset of overt clinical disease. And so we're not eliminating an opportunity. To me, we're broadening that opportunity. The other part of that is the potential to use some of these biology modulating compounds that we've developed at much lower doses and stay away from safety concerns. Part of as I've studied attrition and looked critically at our animal studies in particular, but not just animal studies, and the diseases that we're ultimately trying to modulate in patients, we're oftentimes modeling them in very different stages of those diseases. And unfortunately, we don't start managing patients and their disease until it's very, very well advanced, and where you don't have a really good opportunity to modulate the disease. You can mitigate it a little bit, but you can't really modulate it because it's way too advanced. If we can get smarter and have better measures and ways of detecting early onset and start to manage those diseases at that stage, I think we've got a huge opportunity to change the course of the normal progression of disease. One of the great things about human biology is that it adapts, and it sort of hides bad things happening because it just adapts to them until it gets to a point where you're at a tipping point and it can't do that anymore. And then you have clinical disease. You go to your physician, and then we're chasing our tail trying to modulate that disease. If we were better at knowing that you're heading down that road and putting those interventions in place, we'd be in a whole lot different place from a healthcare perspective.
And I'm sure Shaipan wants to chime in too here, but that's, I think, where some of the pharma incentives can get aligned as well, right? I've been part of, not every time, but numerous discussions where you have, a therapy that could, halt progression at a certain stage, that manifested in many different therapeutic areas. But the earlier you can, you need to identify people before the damage has been done, whether that's, inflammation or cell death or these types of things. And so, obviously the earlier you can intervene, the more value your therapy is to the health system, and, a higher, and that's the direction we're coming to, value sharing, outcomes-based reimbursement, whatever this looks like, or simply justifying an investment into your therapy. If the earlier you cannot get it into the hands of the patient, the larger that's going to be. And Brian, I like one of your points. Not only then can you maximize the benefit of treating with a given therapy, you can start to understand what that disease looks like at an earlier stage and start building a data set and start understanding prevention at a better level as well. And even if it's that therapy providing kind of the economic return on investing into the diagnostic, I think it'll be nothing but good for kind of medical understanding as a whole. Right?
As a pathologist, my education was really about the pathogenesis of disease. As a practicing pathologist, most of it is about what word do I use to describe when it's gone too far. Right. So what I was trained to do and what I actually do are very different. And I think we need to get back to what we were trained to do, which is to understand the progression of disease.
Yeah, and I think when you guys are talking about incentives, right, as we're coming to an end of this session, which goes pretty quickly, I think we don't give out bonuses for when something does not move to the next phase, right? We actually almost like punish people for it, right? So until we've really changed that, right, that there is opportunities to learn. And I think my final point here today, right, is that each pharma, and I was just actually at a large pharmaceutical company last week, and we're talking about how can we learn from everything that has already happened, right? As we're looking at different technologies, including AI. And to me, is each pharma should have a chief learning officer that allows their group to learn from what we call them failures, right? But to me, there's a learning experiences. And until that truly happens, right, and we actually provide budgets for those learnings, and not just the next, innovation, right, that we can attach to the plane, make it heavy, and then crash, 2-3 years down the road. I think until that happens, we're going to be having the same discussion that we're having today, 10 years down the road.
Well, and building on that and getting back to the comment I made to Nick earlier, is to not think of learning as a retrospective activity, but a prospective activity. So think about learning on the front end so that we collect the right information to actually be able to learn and change the course of some future project. That's the difference. Right now, learning is retrospective. Okay, I blew it. Now I got to go back and try to understand, and we don't do that enough. But if we really prospectively thought about learning, how do I learn from this experience so that, the likelihood that I'm not going to be successful, at least I'm changing the course of future events.
Nick, final words?
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I'm just thinking, Brian, the difference between what you were trained and what you're doing in practice. And of course, as kind of digital minded people, we've been talking for a while on can we start redefining disease, not based on kind of phenotypic observations, but more along the lines of root cause and drivers. And, maybe next, I think one of the most, I'd say biggest potential, but let's just say my personal most interesting area around that, I think, is going to be mental health, because there's also a very transient nature to kind of the state you're in mentally. And I think, talked about closing the loop, getting data back from patients, that's also going to help you personalize it to a given individual, but it's going to create population level insights on what's going on as well, that I think will be able to also translate their way back into pharma, whether it's discovery or simply what digital endpoints and metrics you need involved in your trials. So.
All right, so with that, we're going to end our Innovation to Impact episode, and we're looking forward to seeing you, and for you, I guess, hearing us and seeing us as well on the next one. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.